Ramaswamy. On the comment section, we debunk, explain, review, and answer questions about comments left by people on your favorite social channels. Are these comments true? Should they have influence on what you believe? Well, we talk to the experts to get you the answers that you need. Welcome to the comment section. I know what happened there, you guys. I clicked on a comment before instead of clicking back on myself. So sorry about that. Today, we're talking about Joe Biden's promise of $2,000 stimulus checks. Here's a quote from the article referenced in our first tweet that I'm going to show you guys. I just thought it explained it perfectly. After promising $2,000 checks to eligible Americans, the soon-to-be president revealed that no, actually, they'd just be getting $1,400 checks to supplement the $600 checks that were passed as a part of the stopgap spending bill at the end of 2020. So we're going to talk all about that. There were so many interesting comments in this thread, so much to dissect. So I do have a few more comments than normal that I'd be going through today, but Anita, our guest, is well briefed on them, and we're going to be, it's going to be fine to talk about them and go through them. Just bear with us though. There's about double the amount of comments that we normally go through, but it's because the conversation was just so important to highlight. So here to talk to us about that today is Anita Ramaswamy. Anita is a freelance journalist primarily covering the intersection of business and social issues. She previously worked in investment banking at Wells Fargo Securities, executing financial transactions for companies across the technology, industrial, and consumer goods spectrum. She studied political science and economics at Tufts University, and I'm so excited to welcome Anita to the show.
Hi, Shivani. Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to talk to you today. Thank
you for being here. So we're going to get right into it. Let's just show the comments really quickly. As I said, everyone, there are 4 comments. We normally only go through about 2, so just bear with us. So this first one was actually the tweet that initiated this conversation. It says they went from 2K on day 1 to actually we meant 1,400 to you'll get 1,400 in March to it could be 1,400 in April. And so there was a lot of discussion about this. The first tweet we're going to go through was the one directly underneath this one. And it said, it said, it might not even be that because of Biden wanting to work with Republicans to draft a relief bill. So it could be 1,400 as of now before it passes. And when the final product is ready, it could be either $600 or less. And then the person who wrote the tweet said, yes, the article talks about decreasing the overall package amount and Dems having to get at least 10 Republicans on board so that there isn't a filibuster, that thing they could just end, but won't. And there's a few other comments that we want to go through. Just again, there are so many like this talking about the numbers. Another one says, claiming they promised an additional $2,000 for a total of $2,600 is incorrect. Claiming they promised there'd be checks on day 1 is just ridiculous. And then I found this set that I think just sums it up really well. Trump signed off on the $600 stimulus checks on December 27th. On January 4th, Biden told Georgia voters that if they vote blue in the Senate race, $2,000 checks would go out the door immediately. Biden backpedaled last week to $1,400 and redefined the definition of, quote, immediately. Another person says, meaning that when he gets into office that it would pass. And if they didn't, then they would never come. You can't just add whatever words you want to someone's quotes and act as if they actually said it. And then this last quote, which is the one I think summarizes it really well. Why is it a surprise that when you say $2,000 check coming your way immediately, that people get mad when you change it to $1,400 someday? So there's quite a bit to talk about here. Anita, as we just went through this, we can see that they're clearly on 2 different sides. So on one side, we have people saying, didn't you promise 2K on day 1? Now it's 1,400 in April. Like, what's happening? And on the other hand, there are comments trying to justify the 1,400 because people already received 600 and that Biden can't do anything without getting it passed anyways. So I'm going to pop that other comment back underneath us, the first one and the second one that replies to it. What are your thoughts on that? Is it fair of Biden to backpedal already? I mean, he's 3 days into it right now. And is he backpedaling? And do you think it's going to end up being less because of Republicans?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different parts to that question. And I would say that overall, like Biden has given some really mixed signals on this. And he got himself in a little bit of trouble at that Jan 4th rally in Georgia that one of the comments had mentioned when he was campaigning for Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, where I'll read you the quote later, but he actually did indicate that it would be the full 2000. And I personally believe that he said directly that, the checks would be coming out the door immediately. Mm-hmm. But before I get into what Biden said, I think it's really important to know and to remember that actually all four candidates who are running in the Georgia Senate runoff supported the $2,000 checks, including the two Republicans. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that, just aside from Biden himself, the Democratic Party has been sending the message of $2,000 checks for quite a while now. Like Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, he actually flagged those checks specifically as a priority item for the party. He said, I have the quote here, "One of the first things that I want to do when our new senators are seated is deliver the $2,000 checks to American families." Mm-hmm. So I would say, like, regardless of Biden's exact wording, which has varied at different times, the Democratic Party has expressed a commitment to the $2,000 stimulus checks being sent ASAP to Americans. Mm-hmm. But I guess kind of moving to the rest of your question and where some of this confusion has come from surrounding the stimulus checks and the amount, the issue here is that the stimulus check measure has really been spoken of as united with the overall $1.9 trillion stimulus plan that Biden wants to pass. And that plan also includes other measures that are not as popular. So, like I said, there were a couple of Republicans supporting the stimulus checks themselves for $2,000, and that is actually likely to have bipartisan support. But the bill also includes some things like state level aid from the federal government, as well as a measure proposing to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, which even some moderate Democrats oppose. So now, in order to get the checks out faster, Democrats are saying, like, okay, let's separate these two. And in order to pass the stimulus check itself faster, they're going to bundle that with this additional funding for vaccines. So even though that isn't like a totally sure shot, that's a lot more likely to pass the Senate. And that's something that the Democrats can probably more easily fight for. Part of that, I know that the first comment had also mentioned filibusters. So give a little context on that. Basically, there are two ways that the Democrats could pass this measure with the stimulus checks and the additional funding for vaccines. Either they could do it the regular way, where they would need 60 votes in the conventional Senate process, or they could use a special process called budget reconciliation. And that's basically what happens when you need to make quick decisions about the budget kind of on the fly. Republicans have used that to pass like tax cuts for the wealthy and other measures before. So it's pretty commonly used. It's not like something that only the Democrats do. For that, all 50 Democrats would actually need to agree and basically fall into line to reconcile the budget, but it wouldn't be that difficult considering that they have a Senate majority.
So that there's a lot there. And this is why this was so complicated. I actually saw another thread I was considering us talking about instead that was just about the filibuster. So there's so many moving parts to this. And I think it gets complicated as well when you know that the average voter maybe doesn't even know what a filibuster is or how the process works. So there's a lot of moving parts here. That's why it's so important to talk about. So let's look at the second comment. Is it incorrect to claim that they promised an additional $2,000? Because isn't that exactly what he did? And I was under the impression that he claimed in Georgia, and there's it's in quotes that he said the checks would be sent out immediately. So is a total of $2,600 ridiculous?
Yeah. So the actual quote from Biden, which I have here, and I'll present it to everyone watching, without my own comment at first. I'm reading this directly from a CNBC News article. He said, "If you send John and the Reverend Warnock to Washington, those $2,000 checks will go out the door, restoring hope and decency for so many people who are struggling right now." But I think the source of the confusion is that separately, also once or twice, he's referred to the $600 as a down payment, right? So that's kind of where people are not sure exactly what amount he promised, but he did quote, and he said it publicly when campaigning, that they would be $2,000 checks and they would be going out immediately.
Yeah, that's very, very confusing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like people are confused on the timing as well, because when he says immediately, like, what does that mean, right? The checks will probably take at least another month. And I guess, one could argue that this is as immediate as the Senate can possibly pass a bill, just given that, Biden administration has the bill teed up and ready to go. But I do think that, like you said before, the average person, the average American watching Biden speak, I mean, they're going to take his word literally, as they should. He's the president.
Mm-hmm.
And even I myself had to do a lot of research to actually reconcile the different messages that he was giving on different events on this topic. And, I looked at different speeches he gave, different things he said at different times. And I would say, like, I spent a lot more time paying attention to those details than the average American even has time to do right now, like, just given all the hardships people are facing.
Yeah, it's very much difficult to follow. And I think that, I don't know, I think that it's exactly what you said. It's so difficult for people to stay on top of things. Things are changing so quickly. And as much as I think a lot of people do feel a relief that, perhaps there won't be as many lies or conspiracy theories. I mean, even watching the press conference, I was like, oh, this is interesting to see a regular press conference where we didn't have to maybe fact check every single thing. However, that doesn't mean that it doesn't come with its other complications. And the fact that, like you said, he's been referring to things in so many different ways and it's not clear at all, which, as you said, it should be. He's the president. People are going to take what he's saying literally. It's just not been clear. And so I think that was also a real worry in the beginning for a lot of people as well with the Biden presidency. And so do you think that the two, if it did end up being $2,600, is that ridiculous in your opinion, as this tweet is suggesting?
Yeah, so I do want to start by being, very clear here that I do think the $1,400 checks are definitely a good thing. But that being said, even $2,600 in total for the second round of stimulus doesn't make a lot of sense to me, just given the deep economic hardship that many families have faced in this crisis. I mean, especially, this is one of the only crises where recession-wise, it actually hit lower income people a lot harder than it hit higher income people. Mm-hmm. And so there's a huge segment of the population that's really hurting right now. So, I've thought about a couple of different alternatives for this. I think that maybe it would make sense to direct a much larger share of the aid to lower income people or even those who lost their jobs during the pandemic, maybe paying it out as unemployment, because honestly, $2,600 in total isn't really going to make a huge difference for those people who are really suffering. Like, I don't know, that's like a month's rent in certain places. Expensive month's rent, but you know what I'm saying. And like, that being said, I actually read something recently that said 10% of world military spending could permanently eradicate extreme global poverty. So when you think about the US as basically the largest military spender in the world, and we spend money on all kinds of things, right? Like, I personally believe the US can actually afford to put more money into direct cash payments for the entire population if it wants. So I'm not saying that just redirecting the money to people who lost their jobs is like the only idea. I think we can actually afford to do a lot more to help Americans. And something that I think would, go to this point is, like, even we would have the cash to fund something like a universal basic income, but that's not something that the US government has deemed as a priority.
Right. Yep. And then let's talk about the last comment here, the one that we found that kind of seems to sort of present many sides, but the last comment I think takes the cake. In a way, I think that this makes a lot of sense. Did they seem to change things around? And if people do get $1,400 or left, do people have the right to be upset?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think given the fact that the Democrats have the Senate and there's also a decent amount of Republican support for the $2,000 checks, I don't really understand why Biden and the Democratic Party are hedging on this when they could really push to pass the $2,000 stimulus checks and the vaccine funding as their own separate bill, the same way that he's planning to send $1,400. So I don't understand what was driving that concession, really. And I think to a lot of Democrats, it's just a little disappointing because after the party overcame some really tough electoral odds and, fought really hard to win the presidency and the Senate, that now party leadership is getting cold feet on delivering what they had originally promised. Mm-hmm. So I think people do have the right to be upset.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, like, we really need to think about, like you said, how are people receiving this information and processing it? It's extremely difficult to understand, like you said, if you don't have time to sift through all of the many different ways he's explained this and what he said. So the clearer, the better. And it's just unfortunately not coming out that way. So of course, people are going to, in this type of crisis, be upset. And, just for reference, like, in Canada, we were getting $2,000 checks a month for months. And you were just able to apply literally online through your bank, and the money was in your bank account a few days later. Granted, there were a lot of people that were not eligible for this that should have been eligible. I'm absolutely not saying the process is perfect. However, the way that they, implemented it was much quicker, I think made a lot more sense, and helps a lot more people much faster than what's going on right now, where it seems like they're just, it's really up in the air. You can tell if the president is just saying, random things about it all the time.
Yeah. I mean, people don't have time for this. And they just don't have time for the back and forth. And I did want to provide a little bit of real world context to that too. This is like a quote that Biden himself has actually said. He's pointed this out many times. Across America, 1 in 7 households, more than 1 in 5 Black and Latino families say they don't have enough food to eat. 14 million Americans have fallen behind on their rent, and 900,000 people filed for unemployment for the first time last week. That's something that Biden knows. Like, the party is fully aware of that. And honestly, there are countless studies that show that putting cash directly in people's hands works. There is just a mind-numbingly large body of evidence supporting something like a universal basic income or a stimulus check. But for some reason, America just can't seem to get past this incorrect notion. And I think this is the fundamental root of the problem, that people think that direct cash payments would somehow like disincentivize work and make people lazy. But every single credible study on a UBI or direct payment actually shows that it's effective. It doesn't affect productivity, right? People don't actually work less. And that paying this money stimulates the economy and produces growth that's inclusive to everyone and not just those at the very top. And all of what I just said about UBI becomes doubly true when we're talking about a pandemic that has taken so many jobs, so many lives, and like hurt the American people so deeply.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment here, actually. I just popped it up on the screen, but I'll pop it up again. This person says they need to issue financial recovery assistance monthly for it to be actually helping families who lost so much. And I think you kind of alluded to that point as well, where you said for a lot of people, $1,400 is just rent. And where have these people been getting $1,400 for the months that they didn't receive a stimulus, right? So I think it's, sometimes I have to tell you, in Canada, sometimes it's really laughable to think about like that. This is just a discussion that is continuing to happen in the richest country in the world, who, spends billions or trillions of dollars on an economy, on the military and on defense, and, can't protect their own capital and is not necessarily helping people that need help right now. It's kind of crazy to think about. Do you have any other comments on this last thing before we move on to my last question?
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to quickly address, and totally agree with you that I think that the US can very much afford to make these payments. That's a common misconception. But I think one thing that I've heard kind of floating around in the public is that, okay, like a lot of people didn't actually spend the stimulus checks. So did they stimulate the economy? And I just wanted to address this really quickly. It is true that most people who received that first round of stimulus checks either put the checks into savings or use them to pay down debt based on the data from that first check. Some are trying to portray that as a bad thing, but I personally think that's not a bad thing at all. Because if you think about it, most Americans didn't even have 3 months worth of emergency savings going into this crisis.
Yep.
And so the fact that the checks are so small, I mean, it just speaks to like, maybe if they were larger, people would have actually spent a higher percentage of the checks if they weren't so small in the first place. And that would have contributed to more of a stimulating effect for the economy. So I think that because the checks were so small, that actually made them less effective. And unfortunately, critics will point that out in an attempt to say like this wasn't a good policy, but that's actually not true. It was never really given a chance to succeed, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And let's expand this conversation a little bit. A lot of people in this thread and many other threads that were discussing the stimulus were also talking about other things, whether they were referring to it from the perspective of a filibuster and stopping a filibuster, or Joe Biden using executive orders to get these things done. They were talking about Medicare for all, eliminating student debt. And my personal favorite, which they're all important, but something I think is that is so important is a $15 minimum wage, which we know that if it had increased with inflation would be closer to $23, which is a discussion all on its own. But I would love to know from you, as somebody who has worked in finance. We just got a funny comment. Someone said, I couldn't even buy a Gucci hat belt with my student.
I mean, it's true.
Yeah, I know. It's we feel you, bro. And so I really just want to know, as we know that it would, if it were to increase with inflation, it would have increased much more. But we're still having this discussion about a $15 minimum wage. So as somebody who has worked in finance, I would love to know what your thoughts are on the $15 wage discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding this as well, where people basically have bought the theory that somehow increasing the minimum wage would cause huge job loss. And I don't think that's true. When you look at the data from Seattle and other places that actually have raised the minimum wage to $15, which at this point is a lot of US states, and any academic, credible study on the topic has basically shown that raising the minimum wage to $15 has a really marginal impact on job loss. And, Biden has kind of come out and said a couple of times that he doesn't think anyone working 40 hours a week deserves to make less than $15 an hour. I actually want to take that one step further and emphasize that I personally don't think anyone deserves to make less than $15 an hour. Because when you're talking about the minimum wage for those who work 40 hours a week, there are so many people that you're excluding. What about those with chronic illnesses or disabilities that prevent them from achieving that 40 hours a week? I mean, look, I was reading this book, super interesting. And basically what it was saying was until, kind of the late 70s, early 80s, most economists actually thought that the number of hours that we as Americans would work would go down over time, right? But yet we're super overworked, undercompensated. I mean, it's just wild. And the whole point of all this technological innovation of having machines to do things for us was so that we could free up a little more of our free time and be able to do that to enrich ourselves and contribute to society in other ways. And so I think it's ridiculous that while we've had this amazing amount of technological innovation, the gains from that have gone to literally just a tiny percentage of people. So I do want to, take it one step further from that everyone working 40 hours a week deserves $15 an hour to broaden it and say, I think everyone deserves to have their basic needs met and the US government can afford to do it.
Well, and it's called a minimum wage for a reason. It's supposed to be the minimum that you need to survive. And we know, looking at very basic economics, that what it is right now is not at all survivable for anyone to have a decent place to live, be able to pay bills, be able to afford food on a weekly, monthly basis, however the calculations were done. We know that. So again, like you said before, it's kind of ridiculous that we're still having this conversation. And I saw a lot of commentary on Twitter about the fact that they were like, guys, we're really discussing $15 minimum wage when we know that it should be more than that, to really have for people to really have a real chance at succeeding. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about. We have a comment here. Actually, I would love to see what your thoughts are on it. Someone says, oh, sorry, I just clicked on the wrong one. I'm sorry. Would it increase inflation?
So I think the idea here is that minimum wage already has not kept pace with inflation till now. So we are already in a situation where we need to correct for all of the growth in prices that has happened for many, many years. And that's why the minimum wage isn't as powerful as it used to be, right? If it had kept pace with inflation, then maybe it would actually cover people's basic needs. I personally think that, on this same point, a lot of people just think that increasing the minimum wage would be bad because of job losses. But actually, there's been a lot of evidence to show that increasing the minimum wage would create economic growth and opportunity. Yeah, I saw another comment here that I think is super relevant and kind of addresses this. We haven't had any growth in wages since 2000, but prices have gone up significantly. It's kind of ridiculous. I fully agree. I mean, it's just not even it's not fair because what it's intended to do has not been fulfilled.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was such a great conversation. I'm so glad that I got to have you on. If you don't know, anyone watching, you wouldn't know because I didn't say it. Anita actually wrote a really great piece for Brown Girl magazine about how different South Asians were planning on using their stimulus check. And that's actually how I found her. We've never met in person, but I just thought that was such a great article. And I knew that she had done her research and she writes about this, so she knows about it. And so I thought she'd be the perfect person to comment on it, and she was. So I want to thank you so much for helping me dissect these comments today. I'm just going to pop Anita's Twitter up on the screen so anyone can go ahead and follow her if you want to see more of her work, what she's writing about. And oops, sorry, did I pop it up? Yeah. And give her a follow. Thank you so much, Anita. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Shivani. It was great talking to you today.
You too. Don't forget, everyone, that you can always send me any comments that you would like us to discuss on the show by DMing me on any platform. The comment section will be live every Saturday right here on HAPS TV. I know we've been changing the time around a little bit, but I'll let you know the time as usual on a post notification on HAPS. So thank you so much for joining me for